good morning, a good afternoon, depending on where you are in the country. I come to you from the traditional territories of the Mississauga, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, and I say that with a great deal of gratitude. I want to wish everyone as well a very happy Black History Month. Je suis ici aujourd'hui sur les territoires traditionnels des Mississauga, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat. Je voulais aussi, et je dis ça avec mes remerciements et reconnaissance, je voulais aussi souhaiter tout le monde une joyeuse histoire, à moi de l'histoire des Noirs aussi. I am going to keep my comments extremely brief because we have such an extraordinary array. This is a real shock and awe array of housing experts here, of housing advocates and experts, and I want to give them the maximum time to share their perspectives, particularly at this important crossroads that we find ourselves at, and that has been exacerbated by the pandemic. The Green Party, and welcome Paul as well, thank you so much for being here. The Green Party is calling and urging this Parliament in this session to recognize the facts in front of us, which is that we are in the midst of a housing affordability and homelessness crisis. And we are urging Parliament to recognize both as national twin crises. Our Green MP, Paul Manley from Nanaimo Ladysmith, has sought unanimous consent for a motion calling on the government to declare housing unaffordability a national crisis. And he will tell you more about that. Perhaps I'll just use my time to share the reason why this is personally important to me, and why, it's always important to make sure we have a variety of voices in politics. I care about this because I'm a person in this country and a member of our community, but also because when I was growing up, we were 6 people in 1 bedroom. And I talked with my sister about what we would have done during this pandemic, with my mother working as a teacher, my grandma working as a personal support worker, and my grandfather working as a caretaker in a factory, all of whom would have been out working during this pandemic, all of whom would have been exposed. And what you do when there's 6 people living in 600 or 700 square feet to protect yourselves. All around Canada, people are living in these kind of unaffordable, unlivable situations. Here in Toronto Centre, half the people are paying at least, a quarter of the people are paying at least half of their income just on rent and utilities and nothing else. And so this is a national crisis, and I'm so thankful to have our speakers here today. Oui, mon histoire, c'est l'histoire de logements inabordables. Moi, j'ai passé la plupart de mon enfance dans un appartement d'une chambre de 600, 700 pieds carrés, avec une mère et des grands-parents qui travaillaient dans les services essentiels. Et moi, je me demande, et je parle avec ma sœur, et on se demande qu'est-ce que nous ferons dans une situation comme la situation de maintenant, si on était obligé de trouver un moyen de nous protéger de la pandémie. Il y a des centaines de milliers de gens qui habitent dans ces circonstances, et aussi beaucoup qui n'ont pas de logement du tout. Alors, notre parti, Paul Manley, merci beaucoup, Paul, pour votre leadership. Thank you so much for your leadership. Il a introduit une motion pour reconnaître ces 2 crises, la crise de logement abordable et le crise de les sans-abri et sans-logement. Je voulais remercier tous nos assistants aujourd'hui, and just briefly to tell you who they are. We have Leilani Farah, who is the former UN Special Rapporteur on the right to housing, and also the Global Director of The Shift, an international movement to secure the right to housing. Margaret Foe, who is the CEO of Aboriginal Housing, the Aboriginal Housing Management Association, and also a member of the Lax Kw'alaam First Nation. Shalini Konanur, who is the Executive Director of the South Asian Legal Clinic of Ontario, Dr. Carolyn Witzman, Adjunct Professor at the University of Ottawa and an International Housing and Social Policy Consultant, Jeff Morrison, Executive Director of the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association, and yes, there we go. I just wanted to make sure that Stephen, you had joined us. Stephen Sutherland, Manager of the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association's Indigenous Caucus. I'm so grateful for your time today. I'm so grateful to have you with us. With that, first, I would like to pass over to Paul. Paul, again, thank you so much for your leadership. Thank you so much for being that voice calling for action on this. Thank you for being the first to call this out. And if you can just tell the folks what you're working on, what you have done, and what you're planning to do, what the Green Party is doing. Over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Annamie. I'm coming to you from the traditional territory of the Nanaimo First Nation, and my riding of Nanaimo Ladysmith falls within the traditional territory of Snanawas, Nanaimo, Staminas, and Layaxan First Nations. I'm not just the MP for a riding that has the highest homelessness per capita in Canada and a place where we're having a crisis. I'm also the critic for the Green Party on housing and homelessness. I know just from my own community that this crisis affects the Indigenous communities. We've seen outbreaks of COVID-19 in several communities here that have resulted in death, and it's overcrowded housing situations. We also know that housing and poverty, lack of good housing and poverty are the number one reasons why children are apprehended by the Child and Youth Services in this country. And it's a crisis here. The percentage of homeless people that are Indigenous in my community and across this country is abhorrent. It's a terrible situation. And my first question in the House of Commons when I was first elected was about the affordability crisis and homelessness. My first speech was about that. And I've put forward a motion 66, which outlines what the problem is across this country. And it looks at the financialization of housing. It looks at the use of Canada as a place to launder money and as a place for the world's ultra wealthy to use as a tax evasion tool, residential housing. And it's created a crisis in Toronto and in Vancouver, and that crisis has spread to other communities. We're also seeing that real estate investment trusts are involved in predatory practices where they are evicting tenants. Where there are no rent controls, they just jack up rents, 50, 80, 100%. Where there are rent controls, they are doing rent evictions and evicting people and then jacking up rents and making housing unaffordable. And housing in my riding has risen by 60% in the last 5 years alone. And that's an average. So I've called upon the government of Canada to recognize that unaffordable housing and homelessness are twin national crises. We need to redefine what the formula is for affordable housing, because we know what it is for an individual, but what is it for a community? What does affordable housing mean in a city like Vancouver or Toronto? We need to remove tax exemptions for real estate investment trusts unless they're being used to protect affordable units, which are being bought up at an incredible rate right now. We can't build affordable units fast enough because they're taking these affordable units and flipping them into market rate housing at an incredible rate. We need to have restrictive covenants on affordable housing that's been purpose-built with taxpayer dollars to ensure that those housing units remain affordable. We need national standards for vacancy control and rent control. And we need empty home taxes, and we need to have better control on foreign investment in residential real estate in this country. We need to prioritize funding for nonprofit and cooperative housing, and we need to ensure that the existing affordable housing stock is brought into that nonprofit and cooperative category. So these are the things that I'm pushing for. I'm so grateful to the expert panel that's joined us today, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you have to say about this issue.
Thank you so much, Paul, for that. You and me both. I'm just so excited to hear what you all have to say, and more than anything, our objective here, Paul's and mine, is to give you a platform to share your messages and reflections on the housing crisis that we face. And so with that, I'm going to ask you just in succession to just briefly share some initial reflections, and then with the hopes that we'll have some time for an exchange with each other. I don't know, first names, last names, I should have asked before. Leilana Farag, would you kindly start us off?
Sure. Thank you so much. And I am definitely a first name basis kind of person. I'm really pleased to be here and super excited that this session is happening. I actually choose to define the crisis as a human rights crisis. And I have two reasons for calling the affordability or unaffordability issues and homelessness issues in this country as a human rights crisis. Obviously, homelessness, grossly unaffordable housing, discrimination in housing, evictions in huge numbers, especially where those evictions lead to homelessness, and the disproportionate impact of all of that on Indigenous peoples and persons with disabilities in particular, all of that are human rights violations under international human rights law. And international human rights law is recognized now in Canadian law through the National Housing Strategy Act. So on the one hand, it's a human rights crisis from that side. But from the other side, that's talked about far less, governments are accountable to people under international human rights law and human rights law generally. But what we're finding is that, in fact, in this country, governments have made themselves accountable to the real estate industry, to investors, to asset management firms, to landlords. And that's the wrong accountability where human rights are concerned. And so that creates a human rights crisis too. We have governments that are failing to be accountable to their human rights obligations and instead allowing themselves to make policy and legislation that really is in the interests of those other private actors. For example, as Paul mentioned, real estate investment trusts receive incredible tax advantages. And it's that enables them to use that instrument to gobble up affordable housing across the country and then impose their business model, which is to raise rents and make those apartments unaffordable to so many people across this country. I'm just going to end by reiterating, we have a newly minted National Housing Strategy Act that says it is the Government of Canada's housing policy to recognize housing as a fundamental human right and to define that right using international human rights law. So we have to start using that legislation to hold our governments accountable. Thanks.
Thank you very much for that. I am going to pass now to Dr. Witzman for your comments. We don't have. I'm passing through that. We don't have any particular order, so I'm just going to pass through everyone. Dr. Witzman, your reflections, please.
Sure. Thank you, Annamie. So I'm speaking to you today from the unceded land of the Anishinaabe Algonquin Nation. I'm going to be wearing my policy wonk hat and talking about looking beyond the crisis to building back better. Finland's on track to end homelessness by 2027. It's not richer than Canada. It's a little smarter than Canada. They have 4 times the social housing of Canada. It's had consistent policy since the 1980s, which is about the time the federal government started abandoning responsibility for social housing. It uses government land for social housing. There's clear universal targets of 25% social housing in all new developments, 30% in the capital, Helsinki. They have a housing first policy that prioritizes secure and decent social housing with income-based targets. And it prioritizes not only people who've been chronically homeless for a long time, but also people who are doubling up, like Annamie was talking about, who are couch surfing and who are staying in violent relationships in order to avoid homelessness. And those targets form the basis of agreements between the nation and local governments that link funding for transit, schools, and other infrastructure with housing infrastructure. Meanwhile, in Canada, for every new home that was created at $750 a month or less between 2011 and 2016, 15 affordable homes were lost. We've made bad policy choices for 4 decades. We neglected the vital infrastructure known as housing. We need to stop creating more homelessness than homes. In order to end homelessness, we need at least 400,000 new or acquired homes in the next 10 years, from studios to 4 bedrooms at no more than $500 a month for households earning less than $20,000 a year. And we need to raise benefits for people who earn less than $20,000 a year. In order to ensure adequate housing for all, we'd need a further 1 million new or acquired homes at a range of sizes at no more than $875 per month for households that earn between $20,000 and $35,000 a year, who are dependent on minimum wage. And we'd need to raise minimum wage. We need to stop hemorrhaging private rental, which is why we need a national acquisition strategy. Canada's done it before. There were 200,000 nonprofit homes constructed or acquired over a decade between 65 and 75, about 10% of new construction. If you double that for today's population and keep in mind that we're a richer country, 400,000 is a baseline. We've done it before. We have a $26 billion rental housing finance initiative, 40% of the National Housing Strategy budget, that provides 100% financing for mostly private rental in return for 20% of the housing being affordable for only 10 years to households earning 120% of median income. If we use that to finance an acquisition strategy, that would be a great start. I'll end there.
I love that. I love that. You know, we had the context from Leilani. I love the policy solutions. This is great. This is what we're here for. Jeff, I'm going to pass to you next. Keep building, keep building. Let's keep going here. We're going to solve this today.
That's right. Well, merci pour la chance de nous joindre. Thank you for the chance to join. My name is Jeff Morrison. I'm Executive Director of the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association, which is the national association representing social and nonprofit housing in Canada. I'm by nature an optimist, so I'll start maybe on a somewhat positive note, which is that over the past couple of years, we've actually seen a lot of good, positive intentions in this space. As Leilani mentioned, in 2019, we had passage of the right to housing legislation through the National Housing Strategy Act. In 2018, we had CMHC adopt a new corporate goal or objective that by 2030, every person in Canada had access to housing that was safe, affordable, and met their needs. In 2017, we had the first ever National Housing Strategy introduced. Just last fall, we had in the throne speech a commitment to end chronic homelessness in Canada. So these are all positive, good intentions that at a national level have been established. What is missing, though, is the plan to bring them all together. What are the policy tools we need to actually move beyond words to actually implement the right to housing in a meaningful way for people on the ground? There's no one policy mechanism. There's no one right answer to that answer. We need really a toolbox approach. And Paul, Leilani, Carolyn, in their remarks, all identified elements of what that toolbox is, and there are more. There are definitely more. We need supply measures. We need support measures. We need to ensure land is available. The list goes on. But what I think has really been missing is a more comprehensive approach and strategy that brings together in a comprehensive way these various tools. So in a way, what we need is a National Housing Strategy 2.0 that is more long-term, that is more innovative, that is better funded, and that not only takes those objectives, such as ensuring every person in Canada has access to housing that meets their needs, but actually turns that into meaningful action. So conversations like today are extremely useful in helping us get to that place. And certainly I hope that those conversations will continue, and that hopefully from the federal government's perspective, when they launched the National Housing Strategy, that wasn't seen as the end of the conversation, but rather just the beginning, because we need so much more in terms of a new revamped national strategy that enables us to move from beyond just words and intentions, but to action. So I hope that's from today and from conversations to continue. I hope that's the place that we can get to.
Thank you so much. That's very helpful, Jeff. Particularly when you talk about moving words to action, because I have to say, back in 2019, when I was a candidate in Toronto Centre and that housing strategy was introduced, it didn't seem like it was going to do much for the people that were in unaffordable housing and unsuitable housing. And I still don't see it as I go through the riding. And I would be very interested in hearing, not to hijack anyone's remarks, but what can be done right now about the urgent crisis? Because as Leilani said, it's a human rights crisis that is unfolding at this moment. So what can we do now? What can we do in the future? I'd really like to hear a bit about that too. And I'm going to tag, excuse me, I'm going to tag Shalini for that and anything else that you would like to say, because I'm sure that in your work, you're seeing this every day during the pandemic. Shalini, to you, please.
Thank you, Annamie. I want to start off by saying that I'm coming to you from the traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabeg Nations, and the Mississaugas of the New Credit. So I work at the South Asian Legal Clinic of Ontario, which is a legal clinic that works exclusively with low-income racialized people. And I also work through a campaign called The Color of Poverty, Color of Change. We work with low-income tenants, low-income homeowners, and homeless clients in direct legal service. And I was preparing for today and thinking about my work directly with clients over the past couple of months and how the pandemic has made the situation of affordable housing even deeper. And I can tell you sitting here today that in January and February, I worked with about 40 clients who are making the difficult decision of whether they should live in their cars, in shelters, or couch surfing. Make no mistake that on the ground, everyone in this event will tell you that we are in a dramatic crisis. And this is absolutely a human rights issue. What I do want to talk about today is the work that we do on the intersection of systemic racism and housing. And that's a really big piece for us. The reality is that poverty and race are key factors in poor housing and homelessness. Racialized people across this country experience disproportionately higher levels of poverty, homelessness, and poor housing. As Annamie mentioned in her opening, we know from studies in Ontario that in racialized communities, people spend 50 to 75% of their income on substandard housing. There are simply no affordable housing options for many of these communities. I know in my day-to-day work that racialized communities continue to face discrimination as tenants trying to get housing and in home ownership when they try to access loans, mortgages, and build that property wealth. I know that in Ontario and across the country, refugees, many of whom are racialized, are some of the highest users of the shelter system, and they report that their experiences in those systems and the ability to get transitional housing are replete with instances of discrimination. We know that redlining is still a massive problem in Canada. Racialized groups are often forced to accept housing that is unsafe, unhealthy, and in substandard conditions. We know, and this is a very difficult one to get data on, that the face of hidden homelessness includes a large population of racialized people, many with no or precarious immigration status, who are left out of the conversation around housing altogether. And we know that governments have continued to fail to address the disproportionate impact of their own housing policy on racialized communities. This year, Canada has had Some may say I wouldn't. They're awakening on racism and systemic racism. And grand statements have been made over and over again about addressing the disproportionality of the impact on these communities. But the reality is that in our housing policy, we still have not seen a drill down to applying that lens. We have not seen a drill down to looking at who are the people in our country who are most vulnerable to this affordable housing crisis, and how do we actionably address those concerns first. In Ontario, our campaign is pushing very much towards addressing affordable housing in targeted communities, making sure that those communities that data show us are falling behind the most are at the front of the line for these programs. So I'll have a lot more to say, but I'll stop at that.
Thank you so much for that. I'm very grateful. As you can imagine, you're describing the experience of my family when you describe that. Not my experience now. I'm very fortunate, but that's what it looked like for me growing up. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to pass now to, to Margaret. Margaret, can you help to feed the discussion, please? Thank you.
Yes, good morning, Niit. Hello. So I just want to start with a basic background to give you a framework of where I'm coming from. First of all, I'm coming to you from the traditional Stalo territories, in particular the Lekamel, the Matsqui, and the Sumas First Nations. I'm also a 60s scoop child. I was literally stolen from the womb of my mother. And that is what drives my passion and my experience walking two worlds, well, essentially three worlds, as a First Nations woman dispossessed from my sense of belonging and fighting that fight for an equal seat at decision-making tables. To kind of give you a background of where my thoughts are on this topic, I'm going to talk about a number of statements that have been made within the last 24 hours from national leaders across this country. But before I do that, I'd like to acknowledge that today is also Aboriginal Justice Awareness Day. And so we want to talk about the rights and justice for Indigenous peoples across this country. So yesterday, today actually, we had a tweet from Cindy Blackstock acknowledging that 8 years ago today, she made a statement at hearings that began on the Canadian human rights complaint versus Canada regarding discriminatory services for First Nations children. The children won that case in 2016 with multiple non-compliance orders that followed. The case continues today. So we're talking 5 years now. Also, National Chief Perry Beauregard quoted Romeo Saganash yesterday in a tweet where Romeo stated that for more than 3 decades, the United Nations system has considered the rights of Indigenous peoples as human rights. We rarely do that here in Canada, as quoted by Romeo Saganash. He speaks with Saganash this week today about the value of UNDRIP and its impact on Canadian Indigenous peoples. Also, there was a conversation yesterday from APTN where they indicated that the feds were never on track to fix First Nations drinking water, says the Auditor General. I am very concerned and honestly disheartened that this long-standing issue is still not resolved. Never mind the fact that here in British Columbia, Mary Ellen Turpel issued a recent report on BC's systemic racism in healthcare with some very clear examples of how it affected and impacted the livelihood of our Indigenous people, including the death of an Indigenous child stillborn due to systemic racism in the northern British Columbia, my home territory, Kitimat. And finally, I'm going to quote with a quote that Lee Miracle said at our recent provincial nonprofit housing through BC Nonprofit Housing, where Lee Miracle indicated that poverty is a policy decision. All of this underlies the current state of Indigenous peoples being denied access to basic human rights, housing, clean water, fair health care, child care, and on and on. And so, though it's admirable declaring a national housing crisis, combining both affordability and homelessness, it's inconsequential if there aren't tangible goals and metrics to address this crisis. It's key to have a framework pertaining to key steps to address it. Such as Dr. Witzman and Jeff indicated, any call to action needs to speak to policy and have clear and sustained investments. I've said it before, and you asked the question, Annamie, what can we do about this? I've said it before. The truth in reconciliation is action. And we have been given some clear examples. The key underlying principles for us underlying any solution is nothing about us without us. And that includes the urban Indigenous peoples as a recognized self-determining community. AMA has demonstrated this for nearly 25 years, and the Phoebe Centre proposed by the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association has been tabled and numbers have been provided. So solutions have been given, and yet we have yet to see concrete action. So we would like to speak to that. One final comment, because I know one of you talked about the affordability of purpose-built rental. We here in BC have proposed to the province of BC a sector-wide agreement that would commit to over $500 million in purpose-built rentals being acquired by the Not-for-Profit Society and overseen by BC nonprofit CHFBC and AMA to retain the affordability of units here in BC. That could be a national solution as well. So bottom line, allow the housing experts in the sector to be at the table to help preserve affordability and drive solutions for our communities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Margaret. And this is really what this is about. You know, this is exactly what we're trying to do here, provide that platform to hear directly from the people who know the issues the best. And, you know, it'll sound cheeky, but I can never figure out a better way to say it. I always say there's talking and walking, and it's time for less talking, more walking, for exactly the reason. The solutions are there. And now it's action time. Finally over to you, Steve, and then hopefully we'll have at least 5 minutes or so just for maybe your observations on each other's reflections. I would love to hear those. Steve, over to you.
Perfect, and thank you, Annamie. And I'm joining today from the traditional territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe, but also in recognizing that in my role in serving Indigenous housing, homelessness, and service providers in urban, rural, and northern Canada, that Ottawa plays a significant role for many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis as a meeting place and as a place of belonging. I work with both Jeff and Margaret. I learn from Margaret every time she speaks, so I'm really thankful to have both of them here today. As I've said, so we serve about just over 100 Indigenous housing, homelessness, and service providers across the country. And effectively, our biggest issue is that what was the most glaring omission in the 2017 National Housing Strategy. And that is the lack of a recognized urban, rural, and northern Indigenous housing strategy. More than 80% of Indigenous peoples in this country do live in urban centers, rural, and northern Canada, where 18% of Indigenous folks in those communities find themselves in core housing need compared to just 12% of non-Indigenous peoples. This number rises significantly in the north, and I think that is one of the most major crises that this government has failed to address. I could go on with more stats, but I'll keep my comments short because Margaret touched on our Phoebe Centre. And the Phoebe Centre is the for Indigenous, by Indigenous, urban, rural, and northern housing centre. And as Margaret said, nothing for us without us. The centre is the key proponent in what we've proposed. And most recently, many people have seen the Finance Committee's recommendations to the Minister. Recommendation 37 is to create a for Indigenous, by Indigenous, urban, rural, and northern housing strategy. And we would be very strongly advocating that the providers have a seat at the table. They're the experts. They have served communities for 40 plus years and provided housing to Indigenous peoples across this country in that time, successfully, very successfully, I might add. So as long as we have that seat at the table, we would be happy. But again, 3 years of talking about a strategy with no actual strategy or funding is a failure on behalf of the government.
Thank you so much, Steve. Thank you so much to all of you. First, I want to say before we launch into things that I really hope you will all come back to talk about these things again. For us, this is something that we are committed to highlighting until there is that action. And right, Paul, when we have a theme, we stick on it. We're very persistent about it. We usually host something every week or so about it. And so please consider this the beginning of that conversation. And we certainly want to make sure our policies and priorities reflect what we've heard today. So just keep that in mind. Excuse me. I would be very interested to hear from all of you, perhaps in a lightning round, because we have about 5 minutes left. Just about, I mean, in response to what you've heard and in response to your expertise in this area, if we could split it into the short term and the long term. In terms of the urgency, this moment that we're confronting right now, I'm just going to go around quickly and just ask you, what are the things today that you would say this would make a difference immediately if we did this today? If you could pick one or two things, I'm sure the list is longer, I would be grateful. I'm going to ask you, Carolyn, what are the one or two things that would make the difference right away?
Well, right away, we need not only a national eviction moratorium, but we need national emergency help with arrears. Last month, CMHC found that 120,000 households in Canada are in arrears. 60% of landlords say that the number of folks in arrears has gone up. I think it's a total of something like $87 million in arrears. These are people who are going to become homeless if they get evicted. And that would be my number one federal intervention.
Thank you. Shalini?
So I would agree completely. Most of the people that I'm thinking about are low-income tenants. I think tenancy law across the board in Canada has to have stronger protections for tenants, has to have a moratorium on eviction, but also we need to think about rent control because the ability for landlords to continually increase rent is part of why we're reaching this issue. And we also need to think about, when we're considering building affordable housing, making it in mixed communities. The way that they structure it now, you land up having more in lower income neighborhoods and not having diversity in terms of the geography of where people live. And finally, one piece that we often don't think about is all the barriers to home ownership that the communities we talk about have. We have serious problems structurally on why those communities cannot get into home ownership.
Thank you very much. Leilani, in terms of that, and then in terms of those who find themselves homeless at this moment, what can be done immediately? Go ahead.
Yeah, and just to say, I completely agree with what both speakers said before me. Eviction moratoriums, rent changes to our rent laws across the country to protect tenants in a more meaningful way, and that home ownership piece is super important. That never gets talked about. In fact, there's a lot of deflection around that. I actually think we need to look at some radical, some really what are considered radical moves. I think we have to start looking at the expropriation of properties where those properties are not being used to allow for more affordable rental accommodation, for example. There's all sorts of idle units as a result of Airbnb, investor-driven production of housing. In other jurisdictions, they are looking at using a stick with landlords or a carrot to say, or owners, I should say, to say you have to use that for affordable housing. And if you're not using it for affordable housing, we will expropriate it for affordable housing. I think we have to look at scaling up the Rapid Housing Initiative, which the government, I think it was a good move. They invested $1 billion in it, but I think there should be a mandated housing first approach. That's the approach where the properties that are purchased or refurbished are made available to people living in homelessness with supports on an ongoing basis until that person no longer needs those supports. And if that means they need them for the rest of their life, they get them for the rest of their life. If it means they only need 2 months of supports, that's what they get. But that people living in homelessness have access to housing. The shelter system in our country should be over. It should only be for emergencies 24 to 48 hours. It is a waste of money. It should all be directed toward long-term housing options for people living in homelessness.
Thank you. Excuse me.
You're on mute, Annamie. We can't hear you.
Sorry about that. Sorry about that. Thank you very much, Leila. Sorry, I was coughing, so I muted myself. My voice is beginning to fail a little bit. I'm sorry. Jeff, over to you, please. Your top couple of things. I know it's hard.
It is hard because, as I say, we really do need that sort of toolkit approach, and the others have mentioned a couple things. I'll mention two. One, as both Steve and Margaret referenced, is the desperate need for an urban, rural, and northern Indigenous housing strategy. As Steve correctly said, it is the big missing gap from the national housing strategy, and it's about time. The time has come for us to really introduce that. The second thing, and I'll build on what Leilani just said, is I agree about the need for a vastly expanded rapid housing initiative as a means to dramatically and quickly increase the supply of affordable housing. In the federal government's initial rapid housing initiative, they introduced the call for applications went out in November. In just about a 6-week period, CMHC received over 670 applications worth a value of about $6.5 billion, all for a fund that was worth $500 million. And that was just in 6 weeks. I've heard of dozens of organizations who didn't even apply because of the quick turnaround. So if we're getting that many demands, that many projects that could proceed in such a short period of time, imagine with a vastly expanded rapid housing initiative with greater funding, what we could do and how many more units we could put in place. So in the short term, those are two immediate steps that we really would insist the federal government proceed upon.
Thank you so much. Margaret, if it's okay, Steve, I'm going to let Jeff have spoken for your organization just because of time. Margaret, lastly, to you.
Yeah, thank you for that. I certainly agree with all of the people that spoke before me, and I do concur with the need to increase the rapid housing initiative, in the housing first model lens. But critical to that is the wraparound dollars that need to be invested with those capital dollars, because the target population that we're talking about, it's beyond simply just the bricks and mortar to have long-lasting solution. It's about giving them the kind of support that they're looking for, and not what government through, as Leilani often calls it, an act of benevolence thinks they need. And so those wraparound supports can be best driven by the nonprofit sector that have had the expertise working in the area. And speaking of framework, it cannot be one size fits all for sure. These issues cross many stakeholder groups, Indigenous, seniors, youth, etc. What COVID has highlighted for us is definitely our youth aging out of care. I saw a quote recently that indicated we have more children in care now than during the residential school era. So a huge problem for our Indigenous families. And of course, the women and girls fleeing violence. The Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report that has also been released for a while now mentions housing for over 200 times. And yet I fail to see anything concrete in the National Housing Strategy to mitigate the ongoing risk to our women and girls. So those would be the highlights that I would focus on.
Thank you so much for that. Paul, do you want to maybe just as a wrap up, let people know what's coming up next, how we're trying to take this and convert it into action? Do you want to tell them what you're up to?
Sure, I would agree with everything that's been said here about all of these actions and all of the different people that are affected, people on fixed income, people who are affected by COVID and low income workers all across this country. And I've been actively advocating with the Liberal government to take stronger measures and to take more measures. If we've signed on to, the UN Declaration on Human Rights, we've signed on to a number of other protocols, we have an obligation under international law, and because of that, we can impose standards across this country like rent and vacancy controls, like taxes on empty homes, like protection on foreign investment to make sure that we don't have predatory investors and that what's been done by hedge funds and REITs and pension funds. So we have the ability and we have the right as a national government to set national standards and deal with this as the national crisis that it is.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much to all of you. I really hope that you heard enough and that this was worthwhile enough that you will come back, because we will be inviting all of you back to say all the things that you still need to say and haven't you didn't have the opportunity to say today. I want to thank you on behalf of our members, on behalf of our party. I want to thank you on behalf of people like myself who know firsthand how important the work is that you do. Someone who's seeking to represent a riding where half of the people live in unaffordable and unsuitable housing that is having an outbreak in shelters right now, and homeless people sleeping in the parks. These things that you are fighting for, I can feel the difference that they would make if we manage to get even a step closer to them. So thank you so much for your leadership and your advocacy. We will be continuing to carry your messages, and we will be inviting you again. Thank you so much, Paul, for all that you're doing within Parliament, and we will be in touch with you. Enjoy the rest of your day. Enjoy the weekend. Thank you to everyone who joined us today. This is a crisis. We will continue to speak out about it with the help of those who are closest to it. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
The Facebook Live portion will now end. La portion de Facebook Live de cette table ronde va maintenant se terminer. And we'll now go to the media to see if there are any questions. We would have one question, one follow-up. Nous allons commencer avec les questions, une question, un suivi. Please use the raised hand feature if you'd like to ask a question. S'il vous plaît, utilisez la fonction de lever la main si vous voulez poser une question. Okay, no questions? Okay, il n'y a pas de questions. Alors, this will finish the roundtable for today. Thank you to everybody for joining us. Merci beaucoup. Ça termine la table ronde d'aujourd'hui. Merci à tout le monde.
Thank you so much, everyone. And again, keep an eye out for the links on Facebook, on CPAC, on CBC, and whichever other networks. Spread the word. And as I said, we very much, it's very important to me, to our party, to Paul, of course, that we are carrying these messages. I mean that very sincerely. And so please feel free to reach out, to brief us, to say there's something that we're missing that we should be talking about. And Margaret, to your point, and I wanted to fist pump throughout this entire thing. To your point, I would say that absolutely creating the space for the people who are most impacted and closest to the issue, to implement the solutions, to take the action is really so incredibly important. So thank you so much for that. Thank you for all of you again for your advocacy. And we will see you soon. This is a theme that we're not going to let go of, right, Paul?